Hey, Cypher here. No, I haven't been on camera for a while, but I figured this is a better time than any. So we've all been seeing all this stuff about Russia and the Ukraine in the news recently. And I thought we'd give a little bit of context to that. See, back in the 19th century, there was a very famous war with Russia and a good chunk of Europe in Crimea, known as the Crimean War. So today's video is on that. So for those who haven't been paying attention to the news, the Ukraine blew up in some protests, threw off their old ruler, substituted a new government, and then Russia decided to get involved a little bit in a little place called Crimea. It's a peninsula just south of the Ukraine as part of the country, but historically it was in Russian hands. A good chunk of the country is Tatar, whereas another chunk is Russian. And Russia decided to capitalize on that. They invaded and now control a good chunk of Crimea. There hasn't been any fighting yet, so it's officially still Ukrainian. But we'll see. So what could the old Crimean War teach us about what's going on right now? Perhaps nothing, but it could be an even deeper lesson. So in the mid-1850s, Russia was in firm control of Crimea, and naturally a good chunk of Eastern Europe. There had been this whole thing going on between England and Russia for a while, and would continue for decades, and it's often called the Great Game, where Russia and England were competing to have the largest empire in the world. Well, obviously that caused some problems, but especially with what was happening in that particular region with religion. Now, for a long time, since 1054 in fact, the eastern and western half of the Christian church had been split up in what was called the Great Schism. The eastern half being Greek Orthodox, western half being Roman Catholic. And by the 1850s, a good chunk of the region was controlled by the Ottoman Empire as well. Now, there's a lot of holy sites associated with that area, and then people want to have control of it. And the Ottoman Empire was becoming well known as the old man of Europe. They were faltering. They were also Muslim, which made it really hard to get along. And what made it worse was Napoleon III, the current ruler of France, decided to go gallivanting around in the region and causing a lot of disturbances. The Tsar of Russia kind of got into the whole idea that he was the protector of the Greek Orthodox religion. And so in order to protect those areas, he declared war on the Ottoman Empire. This happened in 1853. He quickly invaded a whole bunch of areas, taking over a lot of territory that really didn't have anything to do with religion. In reality, this probably had a great deal more to do with the Great Game. And so in response, an international coalition was founded. France, England, the Ottoman Empire, and Sardinia, which would later become Italy, all joined forces to attack Russia. This is what started the Crimean War. Now, what you have to understand about the Crimean War is that it wasn't only fought in Crimea. It was actually fought throughout the Black Sea, a whole bunch of areas in the Caucasus, and even in places like the Caspian and White Seas. Very wide-flung war. But the great deal of fighting and the most famous parts of the war happened in Crimea. Now, the reason why this war got really famous really quick is because it turned nasty. It is hard to describe the bloodshed that happened on Crimean soil at that point without referencing other wars, like World War I or the Civil War. In fact, in many ways, this war was just a precursor to the Civil War in terms of the carnage in which happened. The worst part of the carnage was just how foolish the command was. Logistics failed to come in, and charges happened that should never have happened. People tried to lay siege to towns for years on end. It was a very bad situation. In fact, the whole creation of field medicine was built up specifically for this war. Technological innovations were also brought around. Things like steamships and telegraphs were all used in this war. But the main thing to remember about it is it was bloody. One famous example of it is the Charge of the Light Brigade, where an entire brigade of English cavalry decided to charge the wrong artillery regiment and got virtually obliterated. But eventually the war did come to an end. Most of the coalition arrived in 1854, and finally the Paris Peace Treaty in association with this war was signed in 1856. Now, there were some short-term victories for the English in terms of this treaty. For instance, they were able to demilitarize the Black Sea. They also solidified where Russia had been prior to the war in terms of its boundaries. Both of these were Pyrrhic victories. By the 1870s, this war didn't even matter. And it's really sad to think about how many people died for absolutely no good reason, because nothing came out of this war. So, the Crimean War may not have a direct connotation to what's happening right now in the news, but there is something more we can learn from it. And especially something we can learn from it to not do in this situation. A lot of people call the Crimean War the first modern war. It had the first use of major new innovations like rifles and cartridge weapons. It had modern military movements. It had the use of new technologies like the telegraph and steamships. Modern military medicine was basically invented for this, but I actually wouldn't agree with that. I don't think we can define a starting point for war or anything like that. You see, this is a modern war in one sense. It's absolute pointlessness. Nothing came of this. In fact, the whole religious aspect that I had talked about earlier was never even mentioned in the Paris Peace Treaties. It seemed as though the whole reasoning behind this war was absolute pointlessness, that people just wanted to fight for fighting. And there's some truth to that. And that is a very modern concept. Many of the wars that we have engaged in the last 60 years have very much been exactly that problem. So how does that lesson apply to this current situation? I'd say don't get involved in Crimea. For us Americans and for the British or any other international coalition that could happen, just don't get involved. Because Crimea has seen enough foreign blood for the time being. So thanks for watching. If you liked it, hit that like button and tell me what you think in the comments. Maybe you have a different idea of the Crimean War and how it applies to the current situation. I'll see you next time with a new video.